Much has been said about Daniel Ricciardo's woes at McLaren and how his career has plunged from grace to grass. But it's time to move on and look into what the future holds for him. So, will the Australian drive in F1 next season? Let's find out. Despite his disastrous showing for McLaren over the past 2 years, Daniel Ricciardo remains hopeful that an F1 team will take the gamble on him for the 2023 season. The Australian got a hefty payout of £10 million from McLaren as compensation after his contract was terminated. With that money, Ricciardo could retire and start a new life, and we don't mean a new life away from Formula One. He can still actively be part of the F1 circle in some other capacity. For instance, his experience as a professional F1 driver makes him a potential F1 analyst. If that's not enticing enough, he can start an F1 podcast or YouTube channel like Nico Rosberg did when he retired. But apparently the Australian isn't tempted by any of these, at least for now. He's keen on driving in Formula One next season, and he's putting all of his energy and concentration into it. At first, there were suggestions that McLaren didn't want Ricciardo to race in F1 next season, but the team's CEO Zak Brown has denied these rumours. It was never a decision between Andreas Seidl, team principal, and I, nor Daniel, to consider not allowing him to race in any other form of motorsport next year, said Brown. And we hope he does. He's a friend of the family and always will be. Restricting a racing driver from racing cars is nothing that McLaren would ever do. Similarly, another report claims Ricciardo will have to refund some percentage of his compensation if he gets a seat for the 2023 F1 season. But from all indications, the Australian racer doesn't mind. His priority is to drive in Formula One next season. However, for Ricciardo to continue in F1 beyond this season, one of the 20 teams on the grid must want his services, and at this very moment, his options are bleak. Some have suggested that a move to Haas or Williams could be the best way to get his career back on track if he really wants to compete in the 2023 F1 season. But Ricciardo doesn't seem to fancy both teams. Rather than join an underperforming team, the former Red Bull driver is reportedly willing to sit out the incoming season in anticipation that a good offer might come in 2024. This might sound like a good idea because a driver of Ricciardo's reputation shouldn't be driving for a team that wouldn't give him a chance to compete for points. Earlier this season, Ricciardo was linked to Mercedes as a reserve driver, with some rumours claiming that he could go on to replace Lewis Hamilton by 2025 if the 7-times world champion calls it quits on his career. But that didn't materialise, meaning the 33-year-old is more likely to watch the 2023 F1 season as a spectator. I've certainly accepted if I'm not to be on the grid next year, I'm okay with that, he said. I've accepted that I'm not going to do everything, or my management team's not going to do everything just to put me on the grid if it's not right or it doesn't make sense, Daniel Ricciardo said. I don't want to jump into a car for the sake of it. Some might interpret his comments as pride, especially considering that his form with McLaren in the last 2 seasons is nothing to write home about. But you cannot blame a man for wanting more, especially considering his recent struggles. Another wrong move would crush whatever is left of his career. Ricciardo seems to have improved in recent races though. A prime example was the Italian Grand Prix, where he looked destined to finish within the point zones. But a mechanical problem forced him to retire after just 6 laps. Days like this certainly are pretty frustrating, said Ricciardo after the race. But give it 24-48 hours and I'll get over it and try to understand what's best for next year. Not in an overconfident or cocky way, but if it's not meant to be, then I'm totally okay with that. I won't be too proud. We haven't certainly given up on getting a seat, but that's kind of where my head's at the moment. So, what's next for Daniel Ricciardo? To start with, the stories linking Ricciardo to Mercedes sound weird, especially because we think Toto Wolff might see Lewis Hamilton's potential retirement as a chance to add another young driver to their ranks. So, technically, Ricciardo's move to the Silver Arrows is off, except if an unprecedented situation arises. But perhaps the Australian still has what it takes to race for one of the midfield teams. Looking at the current midfield teams, a move to Alpine wouldn't be bad for the Australian. Alpine's main driver, Fernando Alonso, is on the way out to replace Sebastian Vettel at Aston Martin. And interestingly, Ricciardo raced for Alpine in the 2019 and 2020 season, so a return to the team looks like a tale written in the stars. But there's nothing to suggest that Alpine wants a reunion with Daniel Ricciardo. Moreover, Pierre Gasly seems to be the favourite to replace Alonso. AlphaTauri could also be a possible destination, but nothing has been said or heard in that direction. And that brings us back to Haas and Williams. As we mentioned earlier, reports say that Haas and Williams don't appeal to Daniel Ricciardo. But on the other hand, these teams don't seem like they are willing to go over and beyond to sign the Australian either. In fact, Haas manager Gunther Steiner hasn't offered any guarantees about Ricciardo every time he's been put on the spot by journalists. Kevin Magnussen's place in the Haas team is cemented, but the same cannot be said of Mick Schumacher. Should Haas choose to sack Schumacher, Daniel Ricciardo might represent the perfect replacement. Nico Hülkenberg is another name that has been thrown in for the Haas seat, but there are question marks over that move, considering he hasn't officially raced since 2019. But he has been getting minutes on the track as a reserve driver for Aston Martin. For what it's worth, Gunther Steiner did admit that the team could opt for an experienced teammate for Kevin Magnussen. I talked to most of the potential drivers, which is my job. There's nothing concrete yet, but we only want to take the smallest risk for the development team, Steiner said. We can take a big risk, which is greater when it works, but it's bad when it doesn't. There are none of experienced and technical drivers who are currently on the market, except maybe Daniel Ricciardo, but his form isn't great at the moment, and we don't know what he's going to do. Maybe he'll sit it out next year. As I said, I will talk to everyone, he added. The situation is even more complicated at Williams, thanks to Nick de Vries' performance at Monza after stepping in for Alex Albon and scoring 2 points. Many are already calling for de Vries to be handed an F1 seat for the 2023 season, even ahead of the more experienced Daniel Ricciardo. That ultimately explains how bad things have gotten for the Australian, and you have to wonder if it could have been different if he had remained at Red Bull. Jacques Villeneuve was particularly critical of Ricciardo and the way his career has turned out since he left Red Bull. The 1997 F1 champion says he is not surprised that the Australian has been snubbed by most teams on the grid. Why would he be? He had 2 terrible years at Renault and even 2 more terrible years at McLaren. That's 4 years, almost half of his Formula One career was bad, Jacques Villeneuve said. Alpine have no reason to take him, especially when he's driven there before. Furthermore, Villeneuve claims that Ricciardo's driving skills have become outdated for the current Formula One cars, adding that the Australian could become lazy if he goes on his proposed 1-year break. While Villeneuve's thoughts may seem harsh, you can understand where he's coming from. Daniel Ricciardo hasn't helped his cause with the abysmal season he's having at McLaren, and his comments about taking a break for 1 season might put off some teams who may be interested in signing him. But what do you think? Is Daniel Ricciardo's time in F1 over? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section.